I knew something was wrong the moment I saw the blood on her lip and the bruises blooming across her arms. She stood on my doorstep shaking, unable to form a sentence, and before I could pull her inside, he arrived, rage in his eyes, rain on his shoulders, and looked at me like I was nothing. That moment split my world open. It was the kind of pain that does not fade but carves itself into bone, forcing you to choose, stay silent, or fight for the person you love most. Everything that followed began with that single, shattering night. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. I have lived alone in my cedar cabin on the northern edge of Flagstaff for almost 8 years, long enough for the scent of pine sap and cold mountain air to feel like part of my skin. My name is Elaine Carter, and at 58, I have become the sort of woman who wakes before sunrise without an alarm, who brews coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and who finds comfort in the steady rhythm of chores. When the world is quiet, I can sometimes hear echoes of my years as a military nurse, the sharp discipline still woven into the fabric of my habits. I fold towels like I'm preparing a field hospital. I stack firewood in perfect rows. I listen, always listen, for things people do not say. My cabin sits at the edge of the Coconino National Forest, where the tall ponderosa pines sway like slow metronomes, marking the tempo of my days. I like the isolation. The silence keeps my mind steady. After my husband passed, this place became a refuge, a kind of emotional quarantine where sadness could settle without swallowing me whole. Most mornings I walk the ridge trail behind the house, letting the thin mountain air clear away the heaviness that sleep never quite washes out. I work part-time at a small veterinarian clinic in town, a place filled with the familiar smell of antiseptic and dog fur. The staff knows me well. They tease me for being too serious, too punctual, too quick to clean a counter or organize a drawer. Those traits are remnants of 20 years patching soldiers back together, and although I retired long ago, they refuse to leave me. Routine is a comforting companion, and I cling to it with both hands. The only part of my life that does not follow a routine is my daughter, Hannah. She used to live with me before marriage pulled her south toward Phoenix. We were always close, bonded through years of laughter and little rituals, Sunday pancakes, late-night movies, shared secrets. When she met Travis Blake, I wanted to be happy for her. Travis seemed polished and respectful, the kind of man who shook your hand with intention and spoke as though every word carried weight. His family in Sedona had money and a certain cold elegance, yet he carried himself without ostentation. At least, that was my impression then. After Hannah married him, her life shifted into a world of corporate schedules, desert heat, and long commutes. She worked as a data analyst, a job that often left her drained but proud. At first, she called me every other day, filling the quiet cabin with her bright, familiar voice. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, those calls thinned. A missed weekend visit, a postponed plan, a vague explanation about work deadlines. I told myself it was normal. Marriage changes rhythms. Distance alters habits. Still, something about the pattern unsettled me. One afternoon, I tried a video call. Hannah answered, but the room behind her was dark, and she angled the camera so only part of her face showed. She smiled, but the smile flickered too quickly. I asked if she was tired, and she said she was fine. The call ended with an odd abruptness, leaving an aftertaste of worry lodged in my chest like a small stone. That evening, I sat on the porch and watched the sky shift into deep violet, the pines turning into silhouettes against the fading light. The air smelled like cold earth and distant rain. I wrapped my hands around a mug of tea and tried to shrug off the uneasiness that had been growing for weeks. Mothers know when something in the world shifts around their children, even before the children know it themselves. As the forest darkened, I found myself whispering a question into the quiet. Was Hannah truly all right? Or was something beginning to crack beneath the surface? You're still watching, and this moment hit you harder than you expected. Please comment number 1 below to let me know you're with me. Now let's move on to chapter 2. The uneasiness that settled in my chest after the strange video call with Hannah did not fade over the next few days. It clung to me the way cold air clings to the forest floor at dawn, seeping into every corner of my thoughts. My cabin, usually a place where silence felt comforting, suddenly felt too quiet. Even the creaking of the old wooden floorboards sounded like reminders that something in my life had shifted without warning. I tried to focus on my chores at the veterinary clinic, but every time my phone buzzed, my heart leaped as though I were bracing for news I did not want to hear. When Hannah canceled another visit, the 4th one in a single month, I felt the first true crack of dread. She claimed she was busy with a project at work, but her voice lacked its usual warmth. It sounded thin, almost papery, as if she were reading words from a script. I offered to drive to Phoenix to see her instead, but she immediately dismissed the idea. The speed of her response unsettled me more than the words themselves. I knew that tone. It was the tone of someone who wanted to avoid a deeper conversation. In the days that followed, little details piled up like stacked pebbles that eventually become a mountain. Hannah stopped answering video calls altogether, choosing only voice calls. During one of them, I heard a door slam sharply in the background, followed by a stifled pause before she continued speaking. When I asked if everything was all right, she insisted that it was, and changed the subject so quickly it left me with the uncomfortable sense that she was sitting on the edge of something fragile. One afternoon, my neighbor, Mrs. Mary, stopped by with a warm loaf of pumpkin bread. She chatted about her daughter, who used to work in Phoenix, describing the city as a place that looked bright on the surface but had shadows that stretched farther than one might expect. I listened politely, but her words nested into my mind in a way that made me shiver. It felt as if the universe was echoing something I had not yet allowed myself to name. Later that evening, I called Hannah again. She answered on the 3rd ring, speaking softly, too softly for the hour. Her responses were short, clipped, and I sensed she was not alone. When I told her I missed her, there was a silence that lasted longer than it should have. She did not fill it with reassurance. Instead, she ended the call quickly, saying she had something she needed to finish. The hollowness in her voice stayed with me long after the line disconnected. I began noticing things I had overlooked before. Hannah always wore long sleeves now, even though Phoenix was still baking under the late summer heat. Her smile, once open and bright, had turned into something tight and carefully managed. I kept telling myself I was reading too much into it, but the instinct I carried from my years as a military nurse whispered a warning I could not ignore. People often hide pain in small ways before the truth finally surfaces. One night, close to midnight, my phone lit up with a message from Hannah. It contained only 3 words, "Mother, do not worry." The hour, the brevity, and the tone struck me like a cold blade. It felt less like reassurance and more like a signal from someone who wanted to speak but could not. I stood at my porch doorway, looking out at the trees swaying under the sharp rising wind. Something was coming. Something my daughter did not feel safe enough to say. And I knew, with a certainty that tightened my throat, that the quiet days in my cabin were coming to an end. If you're still watching and you can feel the tension building, please comment number 2 below to let me know you're with me. Now let's move on to chapter 3. The morning began with a strange heaviness in the air, the kind that settles over the mountains before a storm. Thick gray clouds hung low across the ridge, and the scent of wet soil carried through the open window of my kitchen. I tried to distract myself with the familiar rhythm of washing vegetables and preparing a simple lunch, but my mind churned with worry. Every small sound made me turn my head. Every quiet moment felt loaded with the echo of unanswered questions. I could not shake the sense that something was heading toward me, something I could not yet name. When the knock came, it was not a polite tap, but a hurried, uneven pounding against the door. My heart lifted sharply into my throat. I wiped my hands on a towel and hurried across the room, half expecting a delivery driver or a neighbor in need. But when I opened the door, the sight in front of me froze me in place. Hannah stood there looking like she had been dragged through a nightmare. Her hair clung to her cheeks, tangled and damp with sweat. A thin cut ran across her lower lip, still fresh enough to shine. Dirt smeared the side of her jaw and streaked her blouse. Her sleeves were pushed up just enough for me to see the bruises on her arms, yellow and green at the edges, deep purple in the center, the unmistakable imprint of fingers that had no reason to be there. Her breathing came in shallow, tremulous bursts, and her eyes refused to meet mine. Instinct took over. I stepped forward, reaching for her shoulders, trying to guide her into the warmth of the house. She flinched at my touch. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, muttering something about tripping or falling. But the explanation dissolved beneath the weight of her trembling. I had treated too many injured soldiers not to recognize the truth behind certain types of wounds. These were not the marks of an accident. They were the marks of someone's rage. I barely had time to shut the door before the noise of tires skidding across the gravel sliced through the air. A black pickup truck lurched to a stop at the edge of the driveway, sending a cloud of red dust swirling around its wheels. The driver's door swung open, and Travis stepped out with a sternness that felt almost predatory. His jaw was set, his eyes locked on the porch like twin shards of ice. Hannah stiffened beside me. I felt her fear as if it were a physical pulse radiating outward. Travis strode toward the house with a controlled, aggressive determination. He barely glanced at Hannah before directing his attention to me. The tension in his posture was unmistakable. With a dismissive sneer, he let out a short, sharp insult. "What can you do, old woman?" The words fell between us like a challenge he fully expected to win. I felt a surge of heat in my chest, a mix of anger, disbelief, and the kind of protective instinct that anchors itself deep in a mother's bones. For a moment, I thought I might shout back, but years of training reminded me that escalation would only put Hannah in greater danger. I held my ground without giving him the satisfaction of a reaction. Hannah moved toward him hesitantly, drawn by fear more than choice. She gave me one last look over her shoulder, a silent apology wrapped in sorrow, before Travis gripped her wrist and pulled her toward the truck. She did not resist. The door slammed, the engine roared, and the truck shot down the road, leaving a plume of dust hanging in the air like the residue of a vanishing hope. I stood there long after the sound faded, the cold wind cutting across my cheeks. The truth settled into me with undeniable clarity. Something terrible was happening to my daughter, and this time my instincts were not wrong. Something had to be done, and it had to be done soon. If you're still watching, and this reveal made your heart drop a little, please comment number 3 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. Sleep refused to come to me the night Hannah was dragged away from my doorstep. I sat at the kitchen table with only the soft hum of the refrigerator for company, staring at the empty chair where she had briefly rested before fear pulled her back into the storm of her life. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the bruises on her arms and the way her shoulders curled inward as if she were trying to make herself invisible. The hours crawled by, and when dawn finally washed the walls in pale light, I already knew I would not waste another minute waiting for answers to arrive on their own. I had to move. As soon as the sun crested the tree line, I called Deputy Marcus Hale. He answered with the tired voice of a man who had been in law enforcement far too long to be surprised by cruelty. But when I told him what I had seen, he listened with the full weight of attention. I described the cuts, the bruises, the distant look in Hannah's eyes. There was a long pause on his end, a pause that told me he understood the seriousness of what I was saying. He promised to look into Travis's background and told me he would call back soon. His steadiness gave me a sliver of comfort, but not enough to quiet the storm brewing in my chest. Marcus returned the call a few hours later. His tone had changed, carrying a heaviness I had hoped not to hear. He explained that Travis had been the subject of a past allegation involving a former girlfriend. The case never led anywhere because his father, a well-connected man in Sedona, had intervened before the situation escalated. Hearing that snapped the last of my hope that this was a misunderstanding. Hannah was entangled with someone whose violence was not new. She was not the first woman he had trapped, and if I did nothing, she would not be the last. I tried calling Hannah repeatedly, but each call went straight to voicemail. Messages went unanswered. The silence was loud, almost suffocating. By midday, I grabbed my keys and drove toward Phoenix, the miles unfolding behind me and anxiety gnawed at my ribs. When I reached Hannah's house, Travis opened the door with a calmness so controlled it felt unnatural. Hannah stood behind him, her posture tight, her eyes darting for a split second toward me before she looked at the floor. Travis claimed she did not want to talk. It was not true, but the fear in her stance told me she felt she had no choice. I tried speaking to her gently, asking her to come home with me, assuring her she would be safe. She shook her head almost imperceptibly. Her sentences were thin and rehearsed, the kind used by someone who has been coached or threatened. I noticed Travis's presence behind her like a shadow, watchful and cold. Every word she spoke seemed shaped by the fear of what would happen if she said too much. I drove to the nearest police station, clinging to the hope that someone would recognize the danger and intervene. Without a statement from Hannah, and without fresh evidence, they said their hands were tied. The explanation was delivered politely, but it felt like a punch all the same. The system could not help her unless she asked for help herself, and she was far too frightened to do that. Later that evening, I received an anonymous email telling me to stop meddling. There was no signature, no details, just a threat wrapped in vague politeness. I knew exactly who had sent it. Instead of scaring me, it hardened something inside me. I drove back to Flagstaff that night feeling defeated but not broken. As I sat by the window with the desert wind brushing against the glass, I whispered a promise to myself. If Hannah could not fight for herself yet, then I would fight for her until she could. If you're still watching and this escalation shook you, please comment number 4 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 5. The storm arrived long before the first raindrop hit the roof. Its presence pulsed through the air, heavy and electric, rattling the windows of my cabin as though warning me to stay alert. Wind howled against the pine trees with a force that bent their tall silhouettes into uneasy boughs. I sat in my living room pretending to read, but the words on the page refused to settle into meaning. My thoughts moved in restless circles around Hannah, looping back to the way her voice had trembled the last time I spoke to her. Something inside me knew the night would not pass quietly. When the phone rang, it sliced on through the roar of the storm like a flare shot into darkness. I reached for it with shaking hands. Hannah's voice, thin and broken, seeped through the speaker. I could hear her breathing hard, as if she were trying not to sob. She whispered that she could not endure any more, The rawness of her tone made my chest tighten. There was no hesitation in me. I grabbed my keys, my coat, and rushed into the storm. Driving through the mountain roads in weather like that was a risk, but fear pushed me forward. Rain lashed against the windshield, streaking across the glass in frantic diagonal lines. The wipers struggled to keep pace. Gusts of wind shoved at the car, threatening to drift it off the narrow lane. My knuckles turned white on the steering wheel as I navigated each sharp turn. Every moment felt stretched, taut with urgency. I prayed aloud for the first time in years, asking only that I reach Hannah in time. After nearly 2 hours of fighting the storm, I spotted the dim lights of a gas station on the outskirts of Phoenix. A lone figure sat beneath the narrow overhang near the entrance. When my headlights illuminated her face, my heart clenched. Hannah looked smaller than I remembered, nearly folding into herself. Her clothes were soaked through, clinging to her skin. Her face carried new bruises, darker and more severe, and her eyes flickered with both terror and relief when she recognized my car. I ran to her, wrapping my arms around her shoulders. She trembled violently, like a leaf caught in winter wind. I lifted her gently, guiding her into the passenger seat. She leaned into me, exhausted, whispering apologies I did not need to hear. I fastened her seatbelt, brushed damp hair away from her forehead, and assured her she was safe now. She closed her eyes, unable to do anything but trust that promise. The drive back to Flagstaff felt longer than the one that brought me down the mountain. Hannah drifted in and out of consciousness, her breathing shallow but steady. Every few minutes I glanced at her to confirm she was still with me. The storm grew worse, hammering the roof of the car, but I kept going, letting instinct guide me home. Just as I pulled into my driveway, the sharp growl of a second engine cut through the storm. A black truck skidded to a halt behind us, its lights blazing against the sheets of rain. Travis stepped out, soaked but seething, moving toward the house with purpose. He pounded on my door, shouting Hannah's name with a fury that made the walls vibrate. I positioned myself between him and the entrance, refusing to budge. His anger radiated off him like heat from a furnace. He tried to force his way past me, but I held my ground, fueled by something far stronger than fear. The sound of his voice sent Hannah into a panic, her breath hitching from the other room. With steady hands, I activated the camera system mounted above the door, ensuring that every second of Travis's rage was recorded. Then I sent the live feed to Deputy Marcus and to Emily, knowing they would understand the urgency. Within minutes, red and blue lights cut through the storm. Officers surrounded the porch, pulling Travis back as he struggled. The moment he was restrained, something inside me finally exhaled. Hannah reached for me from the hallway, her voice barely audible. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the weight of the night settle against my chest. The storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, a different kind of battle had just begun. The storm had not yet passed when the officers led Travis away from my porch, and the rain continued to batter the windows with the same fierce rhythm that had shaken the house earlier. The flashing lights from the police cars washed over the walls in harsh bursts of red and blue, creating a strange, disorienting glow across the living room. I guided Hannah to the couch, helping her sit down slowly. Her body trembled with the last remnants of fear, and her breaths came in uneven waves. I wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, hoping to offer at least a small measure of safety after the chaos of the night. Marcus stepped inside, shaking rain from his jacket. His expression carried the weight of everything unsaid. He explained that Travis had been taken into custody for making threats and attempting to force his way into the house. The charges would hold, but only for a limited time. Without a formal statement from Hannah, he would be released sooner than any of us wanted. The idea of Travis walking free again sent a cold shiver down my spine. I could only imagine how much worse it felt for Hannah. She stared at the floor, eyes unfocused, hands gripping the edge of the blanket. Her breathing quickened again as the reality of the situation settled over her. The bruises on her face seemed darker under the soft lamplight. I could feel her spiraling, trapped between the terror of what she had endured and the fear of what might happen next. I sat beside her quietly, knowing that my presence mattered more than any words I could offer. Marcus shared more troubling news. The Blake family had already hired attorneys and were pushing for Travis's immediate release. Their influence carried far, and the pressure they applied was swift. Hearing this made Hannah's shoulders stiffen with dread. She had spent years trying to survive within the confines of her marriage, and now the full weight of Travis's family was looming over her like another storm. Not long after Marcus finished speaking, my phone rang. It was Emily. She explained in a steady, serious tone that they had discovered evidence indicating that Travis had secretly recorded one of Hannah's therapy sessions using a device hidden in her car. The betrayal in that act was staggering. It was a violation not only of her privacy, but also of her dignity, her work, and her ability to heal. Hannah pressed her palm to her forehead as Emily's words reached her. The despair in her expression tore at my heart. She whispered that the recording would ruin her if it became public. Her job depended on her credibility, and Travis knew that. He had chosen his weapon carefully. The fear that overwhelmed her was almost palpable. For a long moment she seemed unable to speak, caught in the crossfire of memories and threats that held her prisoner more effectively than any lock or chain. I placed a hand on her shoulder, not to push or persuade, but simply to anchor her. I reminded her, in the quietest way I could, that she was no longer alone. She leaned against me, her forehead resting lightly on my shoulder. I felt her trembling gradually ease, replaced by a slow, painful steadiness. Her breathing settled enough for her to lift her head. The decision came softly, almost like an exhale. She agreed to make a statement. It was not loud or triumphant. It was fragile and brave, the beginning of a new path carved through fear. I squeezed her hand gently, letting her know I heard her clearly. Marcus prepared to leave, promising to start assembling everything needed to move forward. When the house finally quieted, I prepared the guest room for Hannah, arranging the blankets and smoothing the pillows like I used to when she was a child. She fell asleep curled against me on the couch, exhaustion finally winning out. Through the window, the storm began to lift. I knew the hardest battle still lay ahead, but for the first time in a long while, hope sat beside the fear. If you're still watching, and this turning point left you holding your breath, please comment number 6 below to let me know you're with me. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. Morning broke with a pale, washed-out sky, the kind that follows a night of violent weather. The air carried a damp chill, and the scent of pine needles felt sharper than usual. I stood in the doorway of the spare room, watching Hannah sleep. She lay still under the quilt, her breathing deep and uneven, her face softened from exhaustion rather than peace. The bruises along her cheekbone had darkened overnight. I brushed a hand over her hair without waking her. It struck me that this was the first time in years she had slept in this house, and it was under circumstances neither of us could have imagined. Marcus called just after sunrise. His voice was steady, but the news he brought was not. He said the Blake family had already mobilized their attorneys and filed motions to reduce the charges. It was predictable, but hearing it out loud still hit me like a cold wave. As the hours passed, the impact of their influence became clearer. Rumors began to circulate online, painting twisted narratives about Hannah's mental state and my supposed interference in her marriage. Strangers with no knowledge of our lives posted harsh judgments, accusing us of fabricating everything for attention. I scrolled through the comments until my chest tightened. The cruelty was astonishing. Even in our small town, people began asking questions that were laced with doubt, disguised as concern. By afternoon, my email inbox filled with anonymous messages telling me to stop meddling or warning that we would regret pushing things further. I deleted them one by one, but each left a bitter trace in my thoughts. Hannah woke around midday to a message from her workplace informing her she was being placed on temporary leave. The news broke something in her. Her hands trembled as she read the words, and her eyes filled with tears she tried hard to blink away. She apologized repeatedly, as if she had chosen any of this. Then the panic came. Her breath shortened, her shoulders shook, and she folded into herself like she was bracing for impact. I held her close, steadying her breath with mine, reminding her of the strength she could not yet feel. Emily arrived in the afternoon with a heavy stack of documents and a look of determined calm. She explained that the Blake family's tactics were standard in cases like these, meant to scare victims into silence. Her voice was firm, outlining the path forward. Secure witness statements, gather medical records, preserve digital evidence. Hearing a plan steadied Hannah slightly, though she still looked fragile, like a candle in a gust of wind. Meanwhile, Marcus went to the gas station where I had found Hannah. He questioned the staff and found an employee who remembered seeing Travis forcefully pull her into a car weeks earlier. That memory, once documented, became a crucial thread in the growing tapestry of evidence. Marcus updated me later, sounding more hopeful than he had in days. Even with these glimmers of progress, the weight of the situation pressed heavily on both of us. That evening, as darkness crept across the valley and settled over the cabin, the faint hum of a car engine drifted through the trees. Headlights paused outside the gate. Both Hannah and I froze. The lights lingered for a long, breathless moment before the car rolled away. The silence that followed was thick with dread. Later, after Hannah finally fell asleep on the couch, I sat at the kitchen table, staring out into the night. My fear had sharpened into something resolute. The consequences of confronting Travis were real, and they were only beginning. But so was the possibility of reclaiming my daughter's life. I knew then that whatever storm came next, I would meet it head on. Morning came with a stillness that felt deceptive, as if the world were holding its breath. The air outside was sharp with cold, and the trees stood unmoving beneath the pale light. I woke before Hannah and found myself replaying the memory of the car that had stopped outside our gate the night before. That small moment of fear sat at the center of my chest like a heavy stone. When Hannah emerged from her room, her face was drawn and her eyes rimmed with exhaustion. I realized that fear had become a constant companion for both of us. Something had to change. After breakfast, Hannah retrieved an old phone she had kept hidden for months. She held it carefully, almost afraid of what it contained. When she powered it on, a flood of messages and images reappeared. Some were short, terse commands from Travis. Others were threats typed in moments of anger. She also found several photographs she had taken of her bruises during quieter, more desperate hours. Each image made her flinch, but she forced herself to keep scrolling, determined to gather what she needed to break free. There were audio files, too. One recorded the sound of a door slamming so hard it shook her breath. Another captured the edge of Travis's voice in a moment of fury. Listening to them was almost unbearable. I felt my hands curl into fists at my sides as I heard the tension in his words. Hannah trembled but stayed beside me, leaning into my steadiness. It took courage to revisit those moments, courage she was beginning to find again. By midday, she called Dr. Patel, the therapist who had been treating her for several months. He listened quietly and then assured her he would provide full documentation of her psychological history. He spoke about the symptoms of trauma he had observed and the importance of presenting them clearly to the court. When the call ended, Hannah exhaled slowly, as if shedding a layer of fear. Shortly after, Marcus arrived with encouraging news. He had spoken again with the employee at the gas station where I had found Hannah. The young man was willing to provide a formal statement describing the day he saw Travis pull her toward the car. The reliability of an uninvolved witness strengthened our position more than I had dared to hope. For the first time in days, I saw a spark of relief flicker across Hannah's face. When Emily joined us in the afternoon, she spread documents across the kitchen table: photographs, messages, medical notes, witness information. She walked us through the strategy step by step. Her voice was calm and unshakable, outlining how the evidence illustrated a sustained pattern of physical and psychological abuse. It was overwhelming to see the pieces laid out openly, but it also proved that what Hannah endured was real, documented, and undeniable. As we worked, Marcus revealed another discovery. He had learned that Travis's father had once faced accusations of assaulting an employee, only to bury the problem with money and influence. It was a chilling reminder that violence often grows in the shadows created by power. The realization deepened Hannah's understanding that she was not just fighting one man, but an entire legacy of control. Despite her fatigue, I watched Hannah straighten her posture, a quiet determination building inside her. She was no longer only reacting to fear, she was preparing to confront it. I felt an ache of pride mixed with sorrow for everything she had lived through to reach this point. That night, we sat together at the table reviewing the evidence one more time. The wind outside swept across the forest, but the sound no longer made Hannah flinch. She lifted her chin and nodded, as if accepting the long road ahead. I rested my hand on hers, feeling the strength returning to her little by little. We were no longer hiding. We were preparing to fight. If you're still watching and you can feel the end approaching, please comment number 8 below to let me know you're with me. Now let's move on to the conclusion of this story. The courtroom in Phoenix carried a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. It was the kind of cold that came from tension, from the silent weight of lives laid bare. Hannah sat beside me in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in mine. I could feel the faint tremor in her fingers, though her posture remained surprisingly steady. Across the aisle, the Blake family arrived with a line of attorneys in crisp suits, their faces arranged into masks of confidence that did not quite hide the strain beneath. The quiet hostility in the room pulsed like a second heartbeat. When the proceedings began, the evidence unfolded piece by piece, each fragment shining a stark light on the darkness Hannah had endured. The video from the night of the storm played first. The image of Travis pounding on my door, shouting in the rain, filled the screens. The low murmurs that rippled through the courtroom confirmed what I already knew. No one could mistake that behavior for anything but threatening. Photographs of Hannah's injuries followed, along with medical records that documented dates and severity with clinical precision. Then came the text messages, the audio files, the late-night threats he had believed would stay hidden forever. The gas station employee gave his testimony with steady certainty. He described watching Travis drag Hannah toward a car weeks earlier, the fear on her face, the aggression in Travis's movements. The defense tried to shake him, but his account held firm. His words felt like a solid pillar rising beneath our case. Dr. Patel's voice was calm but heavy as he outlined Hannah's diagnosis. He spoke of her anxiety, her hypervigilance, the trauma responses he had watched develop over time. Each point carved deeper into the truth, leaving little room for doubt. I felt the knot in my chest loosen slightly as I listened. Travis shifted often in his seat, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle jumped along the side of his face. His confidence eroded further when Marcus presented details about his father's buried accusations. The Blake family stiffened, their polished facade beginning to crack under the weight of their own history. Finally, Hannah stood. Her voice trembled at first, but strength gradually shaped her words. She described the fear, the control, the isolation, and the night she realized she might not survive if she stayed. It was the bravest moment I had ever witnessed. The verdict arrived like a long-awaited breath. Travis was sentenced to 10 years, 7 to be served without exception. Financial accounts were restored to Hannah. Outside, sunlight spilled across the courthouse steps as we walked out. Hannah leaned into me, weary but free. For the first time in a long while, the path ahead felt open. The days following the trial passed quietly, as if the world were finally allowing us to breathe again. When Hannah and I returned to the cabin, the familiar scent of pine and the soft rustle of the forest welcomed us home. For the first time in months, the air inside the house did not feel heavy. There were no sudden car engines outside, no shadows stretching longer than they should, just silence, warm and honest. Hannah settled into a gentle routine. She met with Dr. Patel through video calls, speaking more clearly with each session. Sometimes I would catch her standing on the porch, closing her eyes as the wind brushed her hair, letting the peace of the mountains seep into her bones. She still carried the weight of everything she had endured, but it no longer defined her. It was simply a part of her past, not her future. I watched her reclaim small pieces of herself. She slept through the night without waking in panic. She laughed softly at shows she used to enjoy. She walked along the forest trails behind the cabin and returned without fear in her eyes. Each step forward reminded me that survival is not a single moment, but a long, patient return to oneself. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the treetops, we sat together on the porch. The sky glowed gold, stretching its warmth across the clearing. Hannah rested her hand on mine, a gesture simple enough to say everything she could not put into words: gratitude, relief, renewal. I understood then that courage had guided us both. Not dramatic, heroic courage, but the quiet, steady kind that keeps a person moving when everything around them tries to hold them down. No one deserves to remain silent in their suffering, and no one is ever too old, too tired, or too broken to stand up against the darkness. As the evening settled, Hannah whispered that she was ready to begin again. I believed her. The forest, once a place of worry, now felt like the threshold of a new life waiting to unfold. In the quiet that follows hardship, we are reminded that healing is a gradual return to ourselves. It is the slow reclaiming of breath, the steady rebuilding of faith, and the acceptance that strength can exist even in the softest moments. Justice does not erase the past, but it opens a doorway to a future shaped by clarity rather than fear. Freedom, once regained, teaches us the worth of our own voice and the power of standing firm in truth. Every step forward becomes a testament to the resilience that survives even the darkest seasons. It reminds us that even in our most fragile seasons, courage can rise quietly and guide us toward a life rebuilt with intention. Thank you for staying to the end. If this reflection resonated with you, I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. Please follow and subscribe for more stories that speak to the heart.